Yeah, so it's a slightly, different type of therapy, but I think it can be. I mean, I've seen it really work well with clients. Not saying it's, there may be people for whom it's not, maybe something else is a better fit, but I think for a lot of people it can be really helpful.
Hello, Intactivists. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Eugene. How are you today?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me on.
I am fantastic. So, Dr. Eugene, for those who don't know you personally, who are you?
So I do, well, in terms of my line of work, I work in counseling, so it's basically I have training in mental health counseling as a licensed mental health counselor, but I also like to do integrate that with things like I'm also a certified health coach, and I like to integrate things also from things I've learned through also about mindfulness and spirituality, things like that, basically taking a more integrative approach to, I would say, to mental wellness and counseling. So yeah, and I use different approaches with clients. With some, it might just be more talk therapy. With some, might be things like cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy or EMDR if people are familiar. It's just very can be very helpful for trauma. So basically, yeah, it's a number of different, but just viewed as like helping profession where you have a number of different tools and it really just depends what people come in with and what they want to work on. Maybe some people just want to work on like also assertiveness or, they might want to work on, yeah, self-confidence, assertiveness, kind of personal growth, maybe things of that nature. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say.
Okay, wow, that is quite a lot. So, I'm going to focus in on the circumcision aspect of
hmm
what you do with the trauma healing of that. So, one of my questions that I have is, how do you know that you are mentally affected by circumcision? Like, what would be the signs in your opinions?
Well, I think it's, I think similar to other traumas where it's something that kind of continues to haunt someone after it happens. So it's, like I work with someone who got into a very bad car accident, and there's certain things that like just will trigger that memory, and sometimes they feel like they're even almost kind of reliving it, or it's, really on their mind a lot. So I think it's, I think it can be similar with the circumcision as well, where if a person's been traumatized, like it's something that's just on their mind a lot, and I think will continue to kind of haunt them even though the event may have passed, but there's still, it impacts their quality of life and their well-being and everything, their mental well-being. So I think those would be kind of some of the signs, maybe, also being, and I think it's pretty natural, but being upset or depressed or angry about being, and again, there's different lows. Not everybody may necessarily the type of trauma where it's like PTSD level, but it may still be something that, just like for other traumas, some people may experience and it may not rise to a certain level, but it can still be, can still, I think, have an effect on their life. And I think in the more serious cases, have very, very serious effects. And I think you also have some, you also have some people that may experience a trauma and they may over time just kind of their system on its own maybe kind of takes care. So yeah, it may not be in the moment. They may still be, of course, maybe a difficult time for them, but they kind of recover more or less on their own. So yeah, I think it really depends. But yeah.
All right, so do you have an opinion on foreskin restoration, on if that helps a victim of circumcision? Does that help them heal, or does that have them like hyper focus on what was done to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not an expert really on restoration, so I think that may be kind of a tougher one to answer, but I think it yeah, I think maybe for different people could different. I think if a person is hyper focused, I think that can be probably detrimental as well. I think it may be about kind of having a balance in a sense because, like if somebody maybe in a war, or, a traumatic, it's maybe they lose their leg. I mean, that's of course can be a very difficult thing, but I think that. I think if somebody, I think that can be part of maybe in a sense, trauma as well as kind of the hyper focus on it. So I don't know. It's hard specifically, I think, to give a good, I think, answer for that one without actually like really being an expert because I'm familiar to some extent with restoration, but not, not an expert in it. So I think it depends how the person approaches it. I think with what type of attitude and what, you know, tension. And I think that it could probably go a number of ways. Could be maybe more of a hyper focus and not so good could be, I think it could, or maybe it could be a positive thing. So I think it could probably go in a few different directions, basically.
Okay. So, what do you recommend for people that are having a really tough time dealing with their circumcision?
I think there's a number of approaches. I think that if seeking out a therapist, which I think can be really good, but I've also encountered a number of people, I think reaching out who have just saying that they've had, unfortunately, therapists just kind of brush it off or just be like, really just make them feel, kind of like, oh, like what's wrong? They just get over it or something. And I think that's really a pretty awful thing. So I think one important thing would be making sure that the person you're working with, I think from the beginning, like, maybe basically making sure that there's somebody who will be supportive and understanding and not just kind of brush it off because I think it can be a trauma just like with I think when people talk about female circumcision like and all when people talk about that a lot of people say like oh how traumatic and and awful and and I think it is but I think for some reason male circumcision in the US and I think in some other parts of the world seems to be so normalized that people don't really even give it a second thought. So, I think having somebody that you can trust and work on, and I think what can be really helpful are things like I think EMDR can be a very helpful one. I do that type of work a fair amount with clients who, may have all kinds of different traumas. It's a good kind of mind-body therapy where we go through and reprocess certain things that have happened in the past. So it's not like clients will, forget that something happened, doesn't wipe them from the memory, but I often get clients like saying that like, oh, like like, wow, that thing that bothered me in the past, like just really does, I don't really think about it much anymore. It doesn't really bother me. I'm able to kind of, live my life. So it doesn't continue to haunt them. So I think, approaches like EMDR can be really helpful. I'm not personally trained in things like somatic experiencing or hypnosis, but I think those things may be potentially helpful as well, not, so familiar, but I think those types of mind-body approaches can be I think all those kind of mind-body approaches, I think they can be helpful. So yeah, I think, there may be other things as well, but that's just something that comes to mind for me, mainly EMDR, because that's one of the main ones I work with, depending on, I think it's good because that one I think can be helpful if a person doesn't really remember the event so well. For somebody who does remember it, I would say that prolonged exposure therapy can be helpful as well, more of an exposure therapy approach. But I think with circumcision, I think a lot of people probably don't really have a clear, but I think as they kind of say, I think there is some truth to the fact that, this, that book, I think a lot of people are familiar with the body keeps the score. So, I think that's why I kind of like EMDR is a very kind of mind-body approach. So if there's any, we go over various sensations that come up in the body, things like that. So that's why I'm kind of in this particular case would be pretty comfortable recommending it. Yeah.
All right. So, what does EMDR stand for?
So yeah, so it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I think it's been around probably since like the 80s or something, but I think it's gotten more popular in recent times. And it basically, to explain it kind of can be a little bit tricky, I find. But and a lot of times people just give the attention to the what they call the bilateral stimulation, which can be like watching, moving your eyes back and forth, watching a dot on a screen, or maybe having like alternating tones in each ear. It goes between one ear and the other. There's a number of ways to do it. That's only, I'd say, part of the process. A lot of it is also just going through a protocol and like kind of exploring what emotions come up, what body sensations, what other thoughts come up. That, part of it's kind of like, in a sense that people are familiar maybe with like free association. So that kind of letting your mind just go wherever it wants and seeing what comes up. And a lot of times I think for clients, like, try to actually stay out of the way in the process as much as possible because I think a lot of times their own mind kind of is able to work out a lot of things and reprocess a lot of things. So yeah, so it's a slightly, different type of therapy, but I think it can be. I mean, I've seen it really work well with clients. Not saying it's, there may be people for whom it's not. Maybe something else is a better fit, but I think for a lot of people it can be really helpful. It's not, and again, it's not like they may forget that something happened, but they may look at it kind of very differently and not, well, it would not have it take up basically as much space, or maybe not take up any space in their head, so that they don't continue basically that they don't continue ideally to be haunted by it. It's just something that remember, but it's like, oh yeah, but I remember that, but it's I'm not bothered by that anymore, and they can continue living their lives, basically have a better quality of life. So that's kind of how I would describe it, yeah.
All right, so I've actually heard from other intactivists who've gone to American therapy or the traditional American
Hmm.
therapies. And they come back and they've told me that a lot of therapists will say, oh, that's not your issue, it's something else. In your experience, have you ever talked to somebody who was genuinely upset about circumcision and you talked to them and you found out, oh, no, it's not circumcision, it's actually that like your dad beat you or whatever? Like, was there
Hmm.
any times that happened, or is circumcision a legitimate cause and the actual reason? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that's a really great question. I think that's another one that may be a little bit difficult to, fully answer, but I try to give my best on that. I would say that I think it can be and issued and because I think also there's a number of factors I think where also like maybe how the age at which it happens, like how aware the person, like I was recently was at like a business type conference. Someone was just came up kind of, it wasn't strictly, there was a lot of like personal growth type things and stories and all of that, and somebody was saying how I think they were from England, but their parents were like really devout Muslims, and I think he said when he was like 4 years old or something, like somebody just came to the house and like took all the boys to like some room, and then he heard them screaming, and like, and then for him too, they did the whole circumcision thing, and like without any anesthetic. And I mean, I think that can be something that to even when you hear about it, I mean, to me it sounds like it has a high potential to be very traumatic, and he was saying how it really kind of really messed with his life, and how he feels later it caused him to go into having concerns about his body image, and like and getting into a lot of drinking and drugs and things like that. I think if a person, if it's somebody's an infant and it happens, I think it can also, I think that can be a legitimate issue as well, because once they maybe find out what was done to them, like, it can really, I think, kind of alter their maybe view on life and themselves, their body and everything. So I think it can be a legitimate issue for sure. I think with a number of things, with some things it can be hard also tell, because there may be other things involved as well. Like there's maybe an example would be like if somebody, is going through a breakup, like a really bad breakup, and they are suicidal like afterwards because their partner or whatnot left them. I mean, I think that is when I personally tend to think that there's probably something else, because I know that, of course, breakups can be quite difficult, but, when there's somebody's being suicidal, I would tend to, again, it's hard to make all these generalizations, say 100%, but I would tend to think there's probably something else, that they're struggling with as well, because to have that kind of reaction. But I think it's, yeah, I think again, I think it's actually a really great question, but I think it can also, it's hard to give like a definite answer, but yeah, like I said, I think it could be on its own. I think it could be totally a legitimate issue. I think that for some people or certain subset, it might be maybe there's something else that they're struggling with, and this is adding on top, or like with the breakup thing I was talking about, that the breakup is, you know, contributing even more, and then they're may be suicidal. So I think that's kind of what comes to mind for me. Yeah, yeah.
Hey guys, it's me, Pods. I'm briefly interrupting this interview to let you know about the Pods e-commerce program. It is vital to keeping the Prevail over the System channel alive. Go and join us on our Discord to learn more. And best of all, it's free to partake in the Pods e-commerce program, and we don't need any of your information whatsoever. This helps us keep the interviews coming along with other Intactivist content to empower, teach, and update Intactivist with very important information, as well as being the voice for the Intactivist public. Thank you all so much. Okay, now back to the interview.
Okay, yeah, because I'm kind of thinking as you're talking about like the breakup being the trigger to a breakdown, it kind of, to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it just seems like, oh, well, you didn't have consent when this body part was taken from you, and now your girlfriend's breaking up with you, and you might not have consented to that. And now you're just mad and you want to lash out. And so maybe that could have triggered the breakup, could have triggered the, I guess some activists call it circumrage, I guess. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and speaking of circumrage, there are theories in the intactivist sphere that violent crimes are happening because of routine infant circumcision. And they
Mm-hmm.
point to the high rape rate for men in the US, and also the fact that if you look at countries that circumcise, they are more war orientated. In your
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
opinion, do you think that circumcisions make men more violent, even if they get circumcised as an infant?
Yeah, I think that's that's also another really good question. I think that, I mean, I think it can if if you look at it just, in a very almost like logical anecdotal way. I mean, if you have a child and the child is born and then like one of the first things it experiences in life is circumcision, like, I think that, I think it's possible that it can mess with I'm not saying everybody, I think for some people it can make them, I think that's a very sort of, how should I say, like, it's a very kind of vulnerable state you're in, and person's, trusting their mother, their parents to take care of them, and then if something like that happens, I think that it can, again, it's hard for me to say yes 100%, but I think it can have a negative impacts in, obviously the actual process of circumcision. I do think there's no legitimate, medical benefit to it or anything like that from all the research I'd done on it as well. And I think there's no, from what I've seen, I haven't found any truly legitimate medical benefit to it, only harms. But I think that's, the physical part, and then also just all the potential trauma that can come from that. I think, yeah, I think it is possible that perhaps, at least some men might be more aggressive or violence prone. I mean, it's a pretty violent act. I think that especially at a very vulnerable age like that, when that's usually done, I think it can really mess with people. Sure. I don't think you have to be like necessarily a scientist. I think it's just something that, and I think the science actually would sooner or later will back it up. I think a lot of the studies that are done are very culturally biased, done by people who are themselves circumcised and, trying to tout the benefits. So you look at like plenty of other places in the world, like in most, I think most of Europe, circumcision is not pretty much all of Europe. I think it's a very rare thing, and I think people are just fine. So I think it's just a culturally biased viewpoint that I think is anyway gradually changing in the US and other parts of the world. But yeah, I mean, I think theoretically it can maybe cause people to be more meant to be more aggressive or violent. I mean, I don't want to make just, statements all over the place saying yes, this is exact, but I do think it's quite possible, yes.
Okay, so speaking of growing up and stuff, we learn how to deal with things differently. So, what are some of the worst coping mechanisms you experience from your clients that you're like, I wish these people who are upset about circumcision, they would just stop, like, please stop doing that? And then the next would be like, what is the best coping mechanism, like your top two?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'll say it in more kind of, because I think that circumcision trauma also falls within the, just a broad spectrum of trauma, whether that's rape, circumcision, could be, again, like I mentioned before, maybe like in a horrible car accident, could be paralyzed or losing a limb. Or could be, smaller things than that. But in general, sometimes people, when they think of trauma, think of something really more like that. So I think, that could also fall within that. And I think some of the worst coping skills, I would say that people, well, I think it's something that, I think it's very understandable too, but, some people may turn to, like the person I was talking about before, turn to alcohol or drugs. And, I think that for that time, it's understandable because I think they just want to feel better and that's what they know to do at the moment. It may not be the best thing, but I think provides some relief and then unfortunately can bring along with it a whole host of other problems, can be maybe overeating, can be like binge eating. There's a number of things I think that people do to try to, to try to feel better. I think that, the probably the better ones are things like, working through whatever method is maybe helpful, where, such as EMDR or some other method, working with someone who's skilled in helping people work through things like that. I think also just, some other ones that come to mind, there can be a lot, but, there can be things such as the kind of the basics, exercise, getting enough sleep, having a supportive community, having what else I could say, like, I think for a lot of people, breathing practices and meditation can be very helpful. I think certain ones can also be very good in a similar way. I think actually the EMDR of kind of helping them to overcome certain, how shall I say, like overcome, certain traumas in a sense, again, kind of like delinking it so that they're not like they may not forget about that the event happened, but the kind of the reaction and emotion they feel is not, it's not, it's much more, it may not even really be there or just be very minor compared to how it was, so that they can live their life, have a better quality of life. So I think there's a number of things, but yeah, I think in terms of the better coping ones, those are some of the things I would say.
You mentioned having like a group or a support system. And in activism, I don't know if you know the group Circumcision Grief, they do actually
I've
have a
heard, yeah.
group and they do go and have talks. Now, I have heard from different activists that they're helpful sometimes,
Hmm.
but also people argue that they're not trained, they don't actually know what they're doing. This can be detrimental.
Hmm.
And I'm curious on your opinion of going to a place like Circumcision Grief, which is kind of like a grassroots, like, hey, there isn't like professional help for us, quote
Hmm.
unquote. Like, let's go make our
Hmm.
own support group.
Right.
What is your opinion on something like that?
Well, I think it sounds in some ways similar to AA almost, which I think probably works well for some people. I've encountered, I've had clients who really loved it and it said it worked well for them. Some people who found that it was not at all a good fit for them. And so I think one issue though that did come up was that, yeah, that people kind of, I think one guy's sponsor was saying that he was being kind of condescending and not like helpful in the sense that hope that a trained therapist hopefully would not would know how to handle the situation better. So I think it depends. I think in terms of just having that community support, I think that can be really great actually. So, but again, I think it depends how people treat it. If somebody starts trying to like, be someone's therapist or whatnot, has no or counselor and has no training, I think it can in some ways maybe do more harm than good. If it's just a support group, just to share, I think that can, support one another share. I think that can be very helpful. I just think it depends how people approach it. In general, I think it can be a very helpful aspect, like a support group. I think that, there can be additional benefits probably to having one. Like I work with Intact Americans, so we recently started doing, monthly these group sessions. And I think it's good when you have like, you have also trained facilitators there and you usually have two people like co-facilitating a session. And I'm not knocking like just the support group. I think they can be great too. I think it just depends like, just like with AA, I think how someone approaches it and how like, how people act within the group if they're trying to like be someone's, counselor therapist and not really being trained in it, as opposed to just being kind of a supportive listener and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's what I would say.
All right. So speaking of the Intact America monthly meetings, how exactly would you go about like getting into those if you wanted to?
Okay, guys, that will be answered next week as we continue with Dr. Eugene Part 2. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section. I'll put his links down in the description below so you can follow him. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss Part 2 and our other Intactivist content that we release every single week. Please share and like this video to get this out to more people. Thank you guys so much for watching.